Welcome to Navigate Now. This is the podcast where we talk about everything about people and places. I'm your host, Jon Docksey, and I'm super excited to have on this episode a very special guest, Eric. Thanks for joining us today. Today's topic is navigation isn't visual. So why do we design it that way? So, Eric, I'm super excited to this conversation. But before we crack on, tell us a little bit about yourself and the journey that led you to the work you're involved with, and what interests you about this intersection of navigation and place management.
Thanks very much. I'm Eric Matthies. I am the policy lead for what we call inclusive journeys at RNIB, the Royal National Institute of Blind People. And what we mean by inclusive journeys is all kinds of journeys, whether it's on foot, on public transport, how things connect up. So just basically everything that happens to you after you step out of your front door. So this is personal to me. I'm registered blind. I have a little bit of sight, but I've had the condition. I was born with the condition that I have. So this has just been my whole life. This is my reality. Things like driving were never on the table for me. So I've always been interested in the ways to get around and the best ways to do that. I grew up in a rural part of the US. And now I live in Manchester in the UK. So it's like, when my parents especially went to visit, I see the culture shock is as much about the difference between a very, very rural area and a big city, even more than it's about going from one country to another.
So you are the second American on the podcast. So that's really,
nice.
Really good to get that perspective and that contrast as well. But before we crack on, we always ask guests on the episode something fun or something interesting or unexpected so we get to know the person behind the conversation.
I feel like all the things that make me unusual now are mostly things to do with being American. Like, I really like baseball. Nobody I know even hardly knows what it is now that I live here. And I have to watch the games by myself in the middle of the night or the next day, catch up on what's been happening with my team, who are a bit rubbish anyway. So it's a thankless task, but apparently somebody has to do it.
Who do you support?
The Minnesota Twins. So I'm from Minnesota. I grew up there. My family is still there. So my dad is a big believer in supporting your local teams. If they're a bit rubbish, then you just can buy the t-shirts cheaper,
And you get that journey, don't you? Like when they do win a game. I'm going to check them out afterwards because I've not come across the team before. So everyone, first point of the podcast, check out the Minnesota baseball team. Cool. Brilliant. Now, super looking forward to this conversation. So, as we always do, let's split it up into a couple of parts. And I always say wayfinding starts before you even leave home. So maybe one thing that we can look at is how do journeys become great before you even do that step outside home? Preparation, I think, is really important for forming a confident journey for any user type. So how blind users research the destinations, I want to think about, the role of mental rehearsal before you arrive. We might think about that in a second. That information is critical, often missing. And I guess done badly, that gives us anxiety, but done well gives us great confidence. So maybe my first question then that we can consider is, what does planning a journey look like for you?
I think it's a little bit counterintuitive, but like a lot of blind and partially sighted people, I find myself kind of doing a bit of a practice, a dry run almost, if I have to go somewhere new, if there's the possibility of doing that. Like not long ago, I was, mostly I work remotely, but when I was invited to an in-person meeting in a part of the city that I don't know that well, my partner actually, he was like, oh, I know where it is, and he was telling me, oh, it's near such a thing. And I was like, I don't feel great about that. So he was actually able to come with me a few days beforehand. We did the journey like the same way that I would do it. So I had a sense of like where I was actually going to be, what it was near, how to get there, all the different little bits you might need to know, like how often the bus comes, all that kind of stuff. And that made it much easier to do on the day. And I know a lot of blind and partially sighted people might do similar, even if it's things like, a new hospital you have an appointment at, a job interview, any kind of one-off thing, I feel like, or anything where you might be stressed or kind of busy thinking about other things on the day. You want to actually think about what it is that you're going to that place to do. if you can take away the stress of that by kind of having that dry run, looking at all the details that might be relevant to a particular person, which is going to change from, one to another, the more kind of familiarity you have in it, the easier it gets. So a lot of this is about kind of just shaving off the rough edges and making it a bit less of an unknown.
Yeah. So to be able to do that, and that's really important for everyone to understand. And this episode is going to be really informative. I can see it already in that sense. So what information are you looking for before to be able to plan that effectively? Obviously, we go from an address, but it's more than that. It's the public transport. It's the accessibility requirements. What information would you say that are the, I don't know, top 5 things that you need to be able to make that planning successful?
So for me, obviously, most journeys are going to involve some amount of public transport. So, is there a bus there or whatever is always going to be the first kind of thing. What's the best way to do that? And there's different ways to find that out. Again, it can be based on, if I know it's near a thing, I will maybe take a longer or maybe kind of unexpected type of a journey to get somewhere if I think, well, this means I can get the bus that I know, And but then obviously there's the element of the kind of first few and last few meters, which we talk about a lot. I need to know where the door is. I'm saying, no amount of like Google Maps saying you've reached your destination or whatever is actually that helpful to me. I really, really, especially now they're making, modern office buildings or whatever are very generic. They're all made of glass. Where is the door? What even is the door? All that kind of stuff is really, really important. And it's the kind of detail that most sighted people don't go into. If you stop and ask someone for directions, you're going to get someone saying, oh, it's over there. But even if they're more specific, they're not necessarily going to articulate that in the way that I need for it to be useful. So there's a lot of concerns around that, kind of the specific detail as well. Like anytime someone says, you can't miss it, I feel like I'm going to miss it,
Okay, so it's about understanding how you communicate that. So don't say no one will miss it. So it's about understanding who we're talking to, who our audience is, to be able then to communicate it effectively to give them that confidence. And as we were just saying, like have less anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess some of those directions information would be from a website of a just I don't know why I thought about this. Say a museum. We go onto a museum's website and they give some directions. What does poor directions look like? How do websites do that well, and how could they improve?
It's getting better now, but I'm definitely used to seeing websites like that say, how to visit us. They give you really specific driving directions, exactly where to turn and what roads and all that, where to park, and really, really specific. And then it might say, by public transport, it just will say 5 minutes from Deansgate Station or whatever. And you're like, well, 5 minutes in what direction? How fast are you walking to get there in 5 minutes? Again, I think there is that understanding that some of it's the kind of, I don't know, car-centric motonormativity of our society, what that says about us. But some of it is, again, I think that perception that they're expecting that they're imagining once you come out of this train station, maybe you'll see, or it'll be obvious, things like that. I think that there is that expectation that walking directions don't need the precision of driving directions, and parking, particularly like in a city, it does feel like that's the critical thing, is where can I park and how much is it and all that. And obviously those things are important for a lot of people. I don't mean that information shouldn't be there, but as a non-driver, it's kind of like it's not always clear that there's an equivalent in terms of, what is the 5-minute walk, say, from the train station to the museum like? What is it? A level surface? Are there proper pavements? Are there crossings? What is the experience of a pedestrian going to be like, in those 5 minutes? Will it be 5 minutes? Is it 10 minutes because I'm a bit slower, I'm a bit hesitant, or you're just waiting at the crossing, or whatever is happening to you in between?
No, it's really important. So maybe what is that one thing that every place gets wrong before you arrive? If there's I'm really interested in this podcast to take away 2 or 3 nuggets for our audience, for our place concerns. Okay. Eric said that I can change that tomorrow. What is that one thing that every place gets wrong before you even arrive?
I think people do expect that navigation depends on site. I think there is an expectation that if there's a sign, if the building is very obvious, that's it, that's enough. And that little things like steps in between, changes in level, how do you cross the road, things like that just kind of don't need to get talked about. There is that sense that you want to make it sound as easy as possible to get to your museum or your event or whatever. You want to make it seem welcoming and I think some people feel like if you make it sound too complicated, maybe people won't want to go. But I think actually, okay, I've talked myself into an answer. I figured out what the answer is, John.
Yeah.
I think the one thing people get wrong is that they like to call themselves and their events, their spaces, fully accessible.
Yeah.
When I read a phrase like that, our event, our venue, our space is fully accessible, I start to worry because I don't think there's any such thing. And when someone says that, I don't know what they mean. I've found
and you
that
don't know what they missed out either, I guess.
Exactly. You don't have any information. And I find as somebody who has a disability that isn't maybe the first one people think of when they think about accessibility. They think about wheelchairs and people who can't walk as much, people with difficulty standing and that kind of thing. They think about steps. They think about accessible toilets. That's really important. Those things are really, really necessary to accessibility. But then they think they're done and they don't know what would make something fully accessible. And for me, the answer is going to be different than colleagues of mine who have sight loss for other reasons, You reach a point where you realize that there's no such thing as full accessibility, and all that you can do is give people the information that you have, about steps, about lights, about signage, all that kind of thing. Right, that it might feel like it's a lot more, it's too much, where it's much easier to just say this is accessible. It's an aspiration. You want to be welcoming. You want to, make your space seem hospitable or inclusive. All these good things. But I think it has the opposite effect of turning off some of us who are used to our accessibility needs maybe not being considered obvious and therefore kind of getting overlooked entirely.
Brilliant. Without naming names, is there something you've not been to? You've made that decision. I'm not going to go because you couldn't do the planning journey didn't work. The information wasn't provided, and without naming names necessarily.
Oh my god! I mean, it's tricky. I think there are definitely things that I don't go to or that I wouldn't consider going to on my own. But that's more about what you're going to do when you get there.
Yeah.
Just in terms of finding or getting around, I think I find bigger crowds, bigger events much more off-putting if I'm on my own. There's more kind of unknowns because there's more people. It's really difficult to go to a football stadium, or go to a festival or something like a big concert, a big gig would be just that. Again, there's the sense that there's so much of these things that are meant for being driven to in some sense or another, that I just find this isn't for me. If you need a car to get to it, even if I could get a taxi or get someone to drive me, I just think, I don't know, man. That's not for me.
Totally understand that. And I think a big part, just kind of thinking around there, is about that preparation journey. The other thing I want to get your insight on is that element of mental mapping. So navigation, as we know, then the title of this podcast, navigation is not visual. It's cognitive. We use our brain in so many different ways to navigate and create that mental mode of space. So I want to understand a little bit about how mental maps are formed using sound, texture, sequence of navigation cues. Landmarks, are they just visual? We can think about that. Smells, acoustics, thresholds, those decision points, those memory triggers. So how do you then, nice segue from that preparation piece, how do you build a mental map of a place that you've never seen?
There's a lot of ways that blind and partially sighted people make mental maps of their environments or places that they intend to go. And they have the most detail I've ever encountered have been from people with very little or no sight at all. They will absolutely, like, when one of them tells you, like, we're going to meet at this particular place, you will know where the bus stop is, how far it is to the crossing, how many turns right and left it is from the crossing.
Yeah.
People will learn that about their bus stops too. It's getting better now with more buses in more places having audio announcements of stops, but that still isn't guaranteed, and it certainly isn't everywhere. So a lot of people will count the turns of the bus before they get to the place that they're intending to go. And we'll keep track, even from quite a long or quite a complex journey. We'll have a sense of, like, I know exactly where I am, at least between one turn and the next.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a kind of, people counting. You count like crossings. Sometimes if you're walking, there's an issue at the moment in England, maybe other bits of the UK as well. Local authorities who are, with the best of intentions, kind of making some side roads. They're trying to increase the priority that pedestrians have there, kind of making the road function a bit of a continuation of the pavement. The idea being that pedestrians should consider that they don't even have to look up, that they're meant to be there. They're not meant to have to worry about cars. Cars are meant to stop for them.
Yep.
And there's all kinds of other difficulties with how that's being implemented. But the relevant one here is that there are people who use those crossings as a way to tell where they are. Like, I know how to get to the doctor, say. It's, you go past 3 side roads and then you turn, or whatever the case might be. If you mess with the number of crossings that they can feel, if you make it too successfully continuing the pavement, it can have the downside of taking away that person's landmark, that kind of tactile. You can tell when you cross the road. You can. There's so many kind of tactile indicators of that they'll be used to, and without that, and if they don't, so there are ways like that to count. You can think, okay, I go in the same way that you might go, it's the second on the left to someone driving. There's an equivalent you can keep track of in your mind if you're used to that from walking. So there's a lot of tactile indicators like that. I know I have particular, landmarks that are tactile, I guess, in that way, just in terms of, oh, here's where the pavement's really broken.
Yes.
Here's where it's always full of bins on bin day. Sometimes it's kind of, permanent things, and sometimes it's like, oh, this is where they probably put that A board that I tripped over before. I should be more careful around here. Although, of course, you always forget, or they move it, and then it's someone else going to trip over. But there is an element. I do have a friend who knows when she's reached a certain crossing that she needs, but because she runs into an A board outside a coffee shop, it's always right on that junction. They're not all good landmarks, but things like that do exist as well.
So what then makes a space easy to remember? Obviously, you've got those random landmarks. You've got often we think about tactile, don't we, in accessibility world, about being the deliberate tactile flooring. What came up in one project we were working on in Wales, dear lady said, I don't understand what you're talking about, Jonathan. She said, do you mean the bubble paving? I was like, I mean the bubble paving. So we can talk about this tactile or whatever.
Bubble paving is so much nicer a name for it. Its actual name is blister paving, which is kind of gross.
Exactly.
It can be very jargony, and I do think that things like that are in people's environment, but they don't really pay attention to it. And they don't, I didn't know until I started the job I have now that the different colors of tactile paving are meant to tell you different things. You get them in different circumstances. So the color's meant to be useful. Things like that. So it feels a bit, I even saw a Tom Scott video once about the secrets on our pavements, and it was about the tactile paving at crossings and the little spinny cone on the underneath the boxes so in the UK at pedestrian crossings where you can push a button to request a kind of a green man to cross the road. You can, after you've pressed the button, you can put your fingers underneath button with the box where the button is, and there's a little plastic cone there with ridges on it, so you can feel it when you get your green man, when it's your turn to cross the road, the cone starts spinning, so it's something you can feel, which is great for people who have dual sensory loss, who have sight and hearing loss. It's a tactile cue that doesn't depend on the crossing beeping, which is another nice thing. that we sometimes get here. But the tactile cue is a little bit more reliable, although sometimes they're broken, or sometimes they haven't been retrofitted, or whatever. But that kind of thing is it's always there. But I once had a friend watch me do this at a crossing in a busy city centre in Liverpool. He saw me do this and was like, why are you hanging on to it like that after you press the button? And I showed him the cone, and after that he was so excited, like for the rest of the day. He's like, whenever we got to a crossing, he was going, can I touch the cone? I'm like, as long as you tell me when it starts moving, yeah, you can look out for the cone. People really, I think, to an extent, really like to know about those things. It does feel like kind of a secret code, or like a kind of another layer of the world, that they don't normally kind of pay attention to. But once you look for it, it is everywhere, which is great, because that hopefully means that I can go everywhere. That's the idea.
Definitely. And you kind of mentioned it there around the audible announcements at bus stops and crossings.
Mm.
So how do you use sound to navigate? What audible cues are you looking out for? They could be at a crossing, a deliberate place, or it could be traffic, or the volume of people, or what other audible cues are you using to find your way around the environment?
Yeah, so when I was a kid and trained in orientation and mobility, it's called, basically getting around without getting squished by cars, I was taught to pay attention to traffic sounds. The idea being, if there isn't like a pedestrian crossing formally at a place you need to cross, you could tell from whether the traffic was going kind of alongside you or ahead of you, hopefully, where the cars were likely to be, when was a better time to cross the road. And I do rely a lot on my hearing to tell how far away things are, how fast the cars are moving, things like that. It's become a bit of a problem, though, in recent years, as we're getting more electric cars, which is good for the environment and other things. But the problem with them is they're almost completely silent, and they just creep up on you. You don't know they're there. I found that the vision I do have is kind of central vision. Can't see anything to the sides of me. So I've often had the experience of suddenly there's a car like right next to you. I had no idea it was there, and they're massive, and it's like it just teleported there or something. So that's definitely a concern for a lot of people, that we are used to certain kinds of sounds, meaning certain kinds of things. And as those are disappearing, not being replaced with anything else, there hasn't been any thought given to how too quiet an environment can actually be a problem. Same with, e-bikes, e-scooters, all that kind of stuff. The same problem, where I think the electric, ness of them is one of their selling points. And again, that's fine, but there's not enough that's been done about replacing sound that used to be just kind of necessary in how a car or motorbike or whatever it was inevitably going to be. But also that really did have an important kind of safety function for blind and partially sighted people. So sound is definitely important in terms of traffic. Sound can also be useful as another kind of landmark. You can tell maybe at school, when kids are outside, you can tell certain kinds of, if you're in if there's a coffee shop or a bar or a pub, there's particular kinds of sounds you associate with people, especially when people are outside. If you're just walking past, it's good to be like, okay, those voices are close enough. There's probably some tables and chairs on the pavement that I should be paying attention for, and hopefully not spilling anyone's coffee in their lap, that kind of thing. So it's different for different people too. Again, it's very possible to have both kinds of, kind of sight and hearing loss, especially because sight loss tends to happen in people as they get older. So often that might be accompanied with maybe less acute hearing as well. And, different things happen to people as they age anyway. But, and different people will pay attention to different things. Again, if you're used to a certain thing, you might have a sense of like, I know what it sounds like when my cane, it moves along this kind of pavement, or that can be a tactile thing too, how it feels, because that can change so much from one material to another, even when it isn't intended to mean anything. Sometimes it does have that kind of effect of a familiar journey. You can probably tell how far along you are from things like, how close you are to the traffic, or what birds you hear in the trees around, whatever the particular circumstance might be.
I often think about tactile as well. Like, say you're in a park, you might have the grass in the park, hopefully, and you might have a gravel path. You might have a tarmac path. You might have different. You might have just a trodden track in that sense, and those are all tactile cues.
Yeah, absolutely.
To anyone navigating, and someone with your lived experience as well, that must be really helpful to know where the grass is, where the gravel is, where the tarmac is, and knowing what your space is. But I was just thinking there, as you were saying about pavements being used by e-bikes, although they maybe shouldn't be, but also walkers of different speeds. Parents with pushchairs, runners, all using that one stage to perform what they need to do. And we all need to be aware that we are sharing that space, and that everyone that is using that space for a different need might have different requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of overlapping ones too. You know, I'm aware that a lot of the things that we call for, like pedestrian spaces being separate from cycling and that kind of thing, is useful to people using wheelchairs, people with buggies, and people with small kids, all that kind of thing. There is an overlap there. It's not quite, but there are absolutely different experiences of the same space going on all the time. I think about that a lot. If you're like in a train station or something, how many different things are happening in that same space at once?
Yeah. So I was thinking then, kind of, we live in a digital world. Digital tools extend our environment. Digital doesn't replace the physical; it aids that journey. So I wanted to think for a little bit around apps and GPS, audio navigation, object recognition, etc. It's got its amazing strengths, but it will have limitations. The trust of digital versus physical cues, and that interaction between when digital meets that real world environment. So what digital tools do you use or maybe rely on a day-to-day basis to aid navigation?
Such a good question. I like your point about it extending rather than replacing the kind of analog experience. From my work, I've learned that blind and partially sighted people are less likely to have a smartphone or kind of ready access to digital environments. Almost, I think it's like it's a big percentage. I won't guess because I don't want to get it wrong, but I know it's quite a lot more of us don't have smartphones or access to the internet sometimes at all. And one of the interesting things I've learned in the last few years is that I'm not unusual in my kind of hesitance to. I do have a smartphone, but I find myself kind of not wanting to like get it out of my bag or pocket very much when I'm out and about. When you're kind of in what might be a crowded situation, you're less able to risk assess your surroundings if you can't see them properly. So I think there is, according to RW's research, more people with, even those of us blind and partially sighted people with smartphones or similar devices are less willing to use them during a journey. So it goes back to what we were saying about pre-planning and the importance of that. Sometimes that's all you're going to do. You're going to make that mental map ahead of time before you step out of your door, and that's going to be basically it. For a lot of people, I've used City Mapper for a long time. Back when it was only in London. So for me in Manchester, it was only on my most stressful visits to the most stressful city that I've been to, I think, where it was relevant. But it was really good because London already had and has fairly consistent audio announcements on buses. So you'd be on a bus, the app will tell you, like, it does pretty good at getting you to and from the bus stop. But once you're on a bus, it'll say how many stops. It'll tell you what they're all called, so you can kind of keep track as you go along. If you've lost, if you've spaced out for a second and then you're like, oh, how far along am I? You can kind of check whatever bus stop name you've just heard with the list of stops that will be on your journey. I really like that. So that's good for public transport, and it's really good now that I can even do it between places. Like I had to go to Chester for work a little while ago, and which is not very far from where I live in Manchester, but it was the first time that I checked and thought, let's see if I can figure out how long it will take me and what kinds of things I need to think about. And it was great. It had all of like the northwest of England, which both where I was from and where I was going were included in. So I could just do the entire thing in that one app, which is really good without having to fiddle around and change locations or anything like that.
So that's interesting then, that switch between you mentioned kind of getting to the bus stop, getting from the bus stop, that last mile, not mile, but that last part of the journey.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that doesn't get missed. You mentioned that right at the start of our podcast. Where's that blend then between the digital guidance and the real world navigation of let's just use the museum again.
Yeah.
I've left the museum and I need to get to the bus stop. Where does that digital and real world experience blend and interact?
I find Google Street View pretty good for things like that. I have a little bit of sight, so I'm usually able to match what you see on your phone with what is in front of you. Because again, I find when you look at most directions, you say, I'm leaving the museum, I'm going to the bus stop. It'll say, walk southwest along blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I don't know about you, but I have no idea. Southwest could be anything. That is basically no help to me at all. So it's really nice to be able to kind of say, what can I see in front of me? And get Street View to look like that. Use that to orient myself a little bit. So I do use Google Maps as well. Again, it's good for walking journeys and good for those little bits of which building is this and where is the door and all that kind of thing to try and keep myself from looking quite so daft.
Sure. What other tools do you use? You mentioned Google Maps there. You mentioned City Mapper. Any specific site loss related tools, access related tools like Navilens, Accessible?
Where it is in place, I have found Navilens to be really useful. It's really interesting. One of the things that I like about that is it doesn't require you to wave your phone around. Some of them do. I've tried Good Maps as well, which is good for interior navigation. I've seen it in a couple of train stations. But that one relies on your camera and things like that. So you do have to kind of wave it around, and then that's okay. But again, if I'm in a busy train station, is that a thing I want to be doing? What do you feel like? So I in a situation like that will use a white cane. Part of what goes into the calculation of whether I use it or not is about how vulnerable it makes me potentially. So it used to be back in the days when we used cash for things, I would fold it up and put it in my bag before I went to a cash machine because I didn't want someone to think there's a guy who won't be able to identify me and probably has 20 quid on him. Similarly, in a train station, if you're like, look, here's my most expensive possession, I'll just hold it out at arm's length. If nothing else, I might just drop it. You don't even necessarily need any malice on anybody else's part. I'm perfectly capable of destroying things on my own. But
what is the best piece of tech that you've used? If there was one piece you wouldn't leave home without, or one app you wouldn't have a phone without, that's a very difficult question. I completely understand. What comes top of the list, maybe, when you're speaking to someone who's you're giving advice to?
I'm not the most techie guy. I do kind of think that and it's tricky because everything has a different app. Like you said, I've used Navilens, I've used Good Maps, there's another map one I can't remember the name of now. It feels like in so many things at work, I want to talk about consistency and about if you don't know that if there's a trial going on somewhere of Navilens or whatever, Good Maps, anything like this. There's no way to know. I know about this because of work. I feel like if I'm a blind or partially sighted person who wants to go to a museum or has to go to your train station or whatever it is, how am I going to know ahead of time, in time for it to be useful? Because I'm definitely, I might, if I have to, stand there holding my phone up, but I'm not going to download your app, fiddle with the settings to make it possible for me to use it, make it readable and everything. Sign in or whatever you have to log into, which was impossible anyway. I appreciate that, two-factor authentication is good for security, but it is bad for accessibility. So you're not going to do all that while you're in the train station, or in the museum or whatever it is. So the ideal, I think the app to be useful for blind and partially sighted people really has to be, we have to know that we need it ahead of time. That information should be at that stage where you're planning the journey, you're looking online or you're talking to your friends, whatever it is that we're doing, and I just think that's where it's lacking. I think the best app is the one that you have at the time. Is that a terrible answer?
Yeah, well, I'm completely switching in that sense. Some photographer said the best camera you have is the one in your pocket.
Yes, yeah.
Forget the biggest, latest, most efficient Canon, Nikon, whatever. the best camera you have is the one in your pocket.
Yeah.
So, but then I like how you kind of segue that back into the planning side of things, because just to run with that museum concept again, if on the website they say we have heavy lens, you can say, okay, I need to make sure I've got that downloaded, so I'm ready, and I can use it with confidence in that space. Exactly. Because I know it is available and working in that sense. So that's digital tools. And as you say, it's not all about digital. Accessibility features are also helpful for everyone.
Yeah.
Not just those with that specific need that feature looks to improve the experience of. So we've talked a little bit there about blister paving, tactile paving, or more importantly, bubble paving. Braille, raised maps, audio information. What I want to think a little bit now about what works in practice and works in theory. What is overused, what is inconsistent, what is poorly maintained, or as we said maybe earlier, poor maintenance is a landmark sometimes.
Yeah.
And then missed opportunities in current standards. So local supermarket car park. My wife was telling me about this. Ramp access, always really difficult to turn. Loads of cars have had their wheels scraped on that. I'm sure it is completely compliant. On the CAD plans, the architects made it completely down to the T. Put a car up there in the real world environment, and it does work if you put the car on that perfect line round the ramp. So that's where I want to understand a little bit around theory and working in practice. I'm really interested to get your perspective on Braille.
So I'm not a Braille user. And I think this surprises a lot of people who know, especially that I've had my sight loss my whole life. But I think a combination of the kind of ableist society we live in, where it's kind of considered better to be not disabled, where the kind of approach to me, not quite in so many words, but basically could be summed up as, well, partially sighted is a kind of sighted, so you can just pretend to fit in, right? And various other things kind of lead to, and this is similar for other disabilities. You can, anybody I know who's deaf can talk about the pressure to speak and to read lips and that sort of thing. So, and a lot of people acquiring their sight loss as they age. It's kind of more difficult to learn Braille then, the same way it's kind of more difficult to, I don't know if you tried learning a language as an adult versus when you're a little kid. It's a similar kind of thing, just in terms of how your brain works. And again, people have sometimes accompanying their sight loss might have loss of sensitivity in their fingers or their nerves, or other kinds of things might have happened to them. So it's a complicated thing. The number of people with sight loss is a lot bigger than the number of people who need Braille. The thing about Braille is that the people who rely on that for information rarely have any other way of accessing the information. So it is really important to have that. But I do find, so even, again, as someone who doesn't know Braille, I've learned from colleagues and blind and partially sighted people who do about what it's like to rely on it. And a lot of times you find Braille is a great example of things being implemented in a way that I'm sure meets whatever standards they need to, but doesn't actually necessarily help anybody. I was at a brand new bus station that had just been built. We were testing it before it opened properly to the public. So a group of people with different kinds of disabilities were accessing the whole space, and were able to kind of comment or ask questions about whatever we wanted. And one of the things they were showing us was the toilets, there were a couple down a little corridor, like you sometimes get. That's fine. They had signs on the doors saying men and women, accessible toilet, whatever the different ones were, fine. They all had Braille right under the printed sign. So right in the middle of the door, probably 5 feet off the ground or something. And I just thought, if I was a blind person, desperate for a wee, am I going to go around feeling all of the walls? Like, what are you going to do,
Yeah.
That it makes more sense to put Braille like near the handle of a door, or you get it on handrails at trains, like on steps and stairs sometimes, and ramps and things like that. Things that already have a handrail, that's where you want it. You want it where your hands go, not where your eyes go. So, and the other thing, go on.
If you put, people might talk in signage design and that kind of thing about eye line. Why put Braille on eye line? It's not for the eye. It's for the hand. Put it on hand line.
Put it where your hands go. Yeah. And I think too the number of people that use it in that context. So like I've had this really well explained by a colleague of mine who wouldn't describe herself as a braille reader, but does know it and can read it. And does, not day to day, not for all of her reading, but does for like medication packets or lift buttons. Or so again, that kind of like not everything, but again, I feel it's almost like a language that you're using in a different way. It might not be your everyday, your go-to, but it's something that is useful in certain places, and especially for like quite short messages. Again, like ibuprofen, or this is the lift button, here are the buttons. Things like that. So when it comes to navigating, that is the time when a little bit um, is useful to an even larger number of people than usual. So I think I don't want to make it sound like hardly anyone uses Braille, so that makes it less important. That's the kind of last thing I'd want people to come away with.
Definitely. We need to understand everyone's needs. What is the most useless accessible feature you've ever encountered?
So when you talk about like the difference between how guidance and standards lead to implementation, I actually think tactile paving is a really good example of this. So like we were talking about the bubble paving that you get at crossings is one of several kinds of tactile paving, and I mentioned too that the color that the tactile paving takes is meant to be informative, and that's in the guidance as well. But what happens is that usually by the time the person, the designing the plan will know the standards, will know the guidance, will look that up, will almost certainly make something compliant. Most of these people are very keen to do their jobs well and do want to make things accessible.
Yeah.
But then that goes through several stages before it gets to the guy who's actually, getting some tactile paving out of a cupboard or whatever and putting it in the ground. I see this regularly where it's kind of sideways to how it should be, because I have a little bit of sight and now I know as much as I do about how it should be done. You can kind of see what went wrong sometimes. That color shouldn't have been used that way, or that paving isn't actually sending its intended message because it's been laid incorrectly. That kind of thing isn't that rare, unfortunately. And again, I don't think anywhere in that chain of people is anyone going, you know what, I'm going to mess this up for blind people. That's going to be hilarious. Nobody wants that. But by the time you get to the contractor, actually installing the concrete in the ground, you're pretty far removed from the people who've had any education or experience, or people who've read the standards, people who've understood why things are the way they are. People aren't, what I find is that sighted people don't know as much as we do about those things that, again, end up feeling secret to people like Tom Scott. Things like there are lots of different kinds of tactile paving. There's different patterns. It's not all bubbles. That's an important kind. But that, again, that tells you a specific thing. That's for a road crossing. There's other kinds that do other things. So that can be used incorrectly as well. I see that I will find myself going, why is this here? It ends up being a problem because it tells you either the wrong message or nothing at all, which tends to make people panic. Another of my colleagues has a story she likes to tell about a kind of a decorative kind of design made on the pavement, something that was tactile enough for her to feel it underfoot. And she thought it meant that there were stairs or like a change in level, where she didn't think there was. And she's a guide dog user, so her dog was walking normally. So she was trying to trust the dog to not, send her down a flight of stairs. But the tactile features of the kind of art on the floor underfoot were giving her, the kind of tactile indication that she is used to, meaning this is a particular thing. So those messages only work if they're consistent. And if they're reliable, sometimes if the pavement is too broken, I can't really tell what's the bubble paving at the crossing versus what's just, it's all cracked and rubbish around here, So maintenance is really important in that way too. You have to have a really clear, for the tactile messages to mean anything, they have to not mean the council never bothers to fix this bit of pavement,
Correct. Yeah, it's kind of using it and not using it where you shouldn't be, in the wrong place as well. This episode has been super insightful. I'm sure everyone's really enjoyed everything that you've been able to share and educate us with on this episode thus far. But just maybe wrapping up around, data can tell us some things, but real stories give us real empathy around a place. So can you share a moment where navigation worked perfectly that you can have you experienced with your lived experience?
The first time so when I was about a year into doing this job, I went on holiday to Brussels. I had a great time. Brussels is a lovely city. And one of the things I really liked about it was we found ourselves in the middle, getting a train from a very big station. And the train station, Brussels Midi, had tactile wayfinding, is what I would know to call it, in the station. But what this actually means is there's just a path on the ground. The floor is made of kind of cream-colored tiles, and there was a few black lines made of that kind of grippy stuff that you get at the edge of stairs.
Yeah, yeah.
So it had good contrast, good feeling underfoot, but it wasn't too, it didn't seem, as far as I could tell, to be causing a trip hazard or another kind of, accessibility clash for anybody else. It's just these straight lines. Through it was a busy station with platforms off to each side. Each time you got to kind of a branch point, it would kind of have it had a Naviland square in the middle.
Yeah.
So that would give you the information that you needed about which platforms were on either side of you, or if you wanted to go carry on straight. It was a really good combination of, again, I didn't know what the Navilands before that, so I didn't have the app on my phone then, but I did recognize the squares when I saw them. But again, either on its own had its place too. Just using the physical wayfinding, I was able to quite happily stroll right down a busy station. What I found was nice too, again, having the little bit of sight that I do, I could tell there were people who were walking towards us, who spotted me and my white cane, following this tactile line, who were stepping out of the way. They were like, oh, that guy needs this path. I will walk over here. He can have his tactile line. I think it had a nice effect on, other people's behavior as well, because so much of what we end up dealing with is about the others around us.
Yes.
It was really nice to see that the system worked so well that they could tell what was happening and how they best could be part of the community, part of the crowd, but like in a nice way. They could, it didn't matter that much to them, I imagine, exactly where they happened to be walking. So if they could just take a step to either side, get out of my way, that meant I didn't run into people, which is a huge worry for me. It's a problem. It's going really wrong sometimes, and everybody got where they were going.
Yeah, and that's a perfect blend into my next thought, really, is what would you say directly to those designers, those planners, or as we say on this podcast, those place custodians, to create places that are more relevant, accessible, usable, that create confident journeys for someone with sight loss?
I would say, yeah, don't neglect the physical for the digital. I know the apps are cool and exciting and some cool stuff is happening, but there's always going to be people who are like, I've never been here before. I didn't know I needed Naviland to get, in my story. But, and again, it works for everybody. That if I was following a completely virtual path, the other people in the station wouldn't have known I was doing that. Well, this way, it was obvious to them how I was interacting with it. So making it obvious to everybody allows all of us to be our best selves, I think. Cool. It's going to be different for blind people than it is for those other groups.
Brilliant, thank you. So how do organisations, you mentioned obviously you work with the RNIB, how do organisations like the RNIB support those with sight loss, as well as local organisations that are looking to support that user type as well?
Yeah, so RNIB is, I feel really lucky to be working someplace with such a strong evidence base. There's a lot of people who are willing to kind of fill out our surveys. I did a massive one recently that had, I think, 80 questions on it. People would spend 45 minutes filling it in, which I think shows the depth of their feeling about this, their willingness to kind of get their opinions and their experiences known and hopefully used for good. So we distilled that evidence into policies and reports and recommendations to local and national governments, to the transport providers, to whoever's making the decisions about the things that we would like blind and partially sighted people's experiences to be taken into account for. So we have reports and policies and recommendations for all kinds of groups, and that absolutely depends on, with something like navigation, the specifics of a local place. So I can only be in one place at a time, but I'm happy to, around the country, work with people from Sheffield's Royal Society for the Blind, or Outlookers in West Yorkshire, Henshaw's in Manchester, Galloway's in Lancashire. Although I can't shout them all out, but lots of different. Everybody knows the place where they live the best. They have the detail. They have the relevant kind of experience that people need to make good choices about that place. So it absolutely depends on people. We're all experts on where we live, and when that can be taken into account, that's when you get the best outcomes.
Brilliant. Maybe just a couple of quick fire questions to finish off. Does that sound okay?
Go for it.
One place that gets it right.
One place that gets it right. Oh my goodness. I really like, well, again, this is kind of like what I was just saying, but I had to go to Wolverhampton for work not long ago, and I had to get a bus, which was great because Wolverhampton bus station has, again, hotel wayfinding and accommodation. It has Neverland available there as well. And it made it so easy to get where I was going. I had such a sense of like, this place is actually designed for me. I know what I was doing. I never have that much confidence traveling on my own. It was very strange.
Love it. One thing to fix everywhere tomorrow.
You need to design maintenance into your schemes, as well as everything's going to look great on day one. But I'm living out here on day 10,000 for some of the things around me. It was really important, I think, to think about that as well.
And one last one myth to bust.
Most blind people can see at least a little bit. They can at least see colors or the difference between light and dark. Very few of us have no sight at all. It's important to design for those people, absolutely. But it's also really important to think about how the visual cues and the visual features of a place will interact with different people's sight loss as well.
Brilliant. So I've super enjoyed this conversation that we've been able to have. We could go on for hours, I am sure. Go into a lot more detail. Maybe we can do that on other episodes.
Yeah, if you like.
But where would listeners who want to find out more from today's conversation, how can they engage your work and keep in touch with what you are doing as yourself, but also as the RNIB?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. Beyond that, I don't really like social media that much. I don't do it a lot. RNIB do. RNIB campaigns specifically is my team's kind of work. And the policy reports that I've been talking about, that I worked on last year, can be found if you basically search for RNIB Getting Around.
Brilliant. So I just want to say thank you very much for joining us on this episode of Navigate Now. I've learned an awful lot. Our audience have learned an awful lot. It's a lot richer for having this conversation. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it too.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the podcast Navigate Now. I've been your host, Jon Docksey, and we've had Eric on this particular episode. But if you want to continue to learn about place and people and about how navigation affects the environment around us, feel free to like and subscribe on YouTube and Spotify. And let's continue this conversation and let's learn together about everything to do with people and places.